Have you ever wondered what you would do if you heard something crashing through the sky in the dead of night? Not a storm, not thunder, but something alive, something that should not have survived the fall. Would you run toward it or away from it? Would you even believe your own eyes if they showed you a miracle dressed in blood and ash? The forest was on fire. Not a roaring blaze, but a slow burn, the kind that eats from underneath leaves glowing like forgotten embers in a dying hearth. Trees cracked like bones as the wind carried sparks through the branches, and overhead the stars blinked through the smoke as if unsure whether to keep watching. Jack Carter had lived alone in that forest for 17 years. A veteran turned medic turned ghost. He had long since stopped expecting the world to send him anything but silence. That night, he was repairing a water filter when the sky ripped open with a noise he could feel in his ribs, like thunder tied to a scream. He stepped outside, saw the light first. Orange streak followed by a crash that shook the ground and made the birds forget how to fly. Something had come down fast and angry, slicing through the canopy like a blade of vengeance. Jack stood still for only a breath, then grabbed his pack and moved. No weapons, just medkit, flashlight, old habits. It took him 40 minutes to reach the crash site. The trees there were flattened in a spiral of heat, bark peeled off in blackened curls. A crater smoked at the center, and in it lay the remains of a ship, not military, not commercial. Small, almost delicate, like it had been built with intention, not industry. And beside it something moved. He approached slowly, carefully, the light from his hand lamp revealing a body, half buried in ash, female humanoid skin like dusk under moonlight, long hair silver tangled and burned. He thought she was dead, until her hand twitched. Jack dropped to his knees, checked for pulse. Breath wound, her chest moved barely. Her side was torn open, ribs exposed, something glowing faintly between them. A pulse, not mechanical, but not entirely organic either. She opened her eyes, they were violet and filled with pain. He said nothing, just lifted her gently. Felt the blood soak through his jacket. Felt the heat of her body struggling to hold on. He carried her out of the wreckage, not looking back, not thinking, just moving, back to his camp, back to shelter. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just gripped his shirt with what little strength she had, as if he were the last solid thing left in a world that had already let go. He laid her on the cot, cleaned the wound with hands that remembered field hospitals and battlefield screams, stitched what he could applied, solve where nothing else would hold. And when the night finally quieted again, he sat beside her and waited. She didn't die, but she didn't wake either. Outside, the fire died down. Inside, something new had just begun. How long would you care for someone who couldn't speak back? How many days would you feed clean and protect a stranger before you started asking yourself why? And what if that silence wasn't emptiness but a storm waiting to form words? She didn't wake for 3 days. Jack kept her alive, the only way he knew how. Fluids through the old line he rigged with recycled tubing. Dressings changed twice. Daily, vitals checked by instinct, not machine. He watched for signs he wasn't trained to understand, watched her chest rise and fall, counted breaths, the way a father might count heartbeats in a child's dream. She was not human, but she was something close, something built on the same foundations of need and pain and breath. On the 4th night she stirred. It wasn't much. A flicker of eyelid, a twist of fingers, but it was enough. Jack leaned close and whispered, "Just in case, you're safe." Her eyes opened. They were unfocused, then narrowed. He could see fear in them. Not panic, not wild animal thrashing, but something deeper. Survival wired into bone. She tried to sit and failed. He put a hand gently on her shoulder. "Easy," he said. "You're hurt badly." She stared at him, lips parting. No words, just air. He offered water. She didn't drink, but touched the cup, traced its rim like it was an artifact. Later that day, she tried again. One word, broken, uncertain. Where Jack blinked Earth. He said, not city forest, remote safe. She frowned, voice slow, like walking through mud. Enemy. Not here, Jack replied. She looked at him, eyes scanning his face with something sharp and sad. He asked her name, Alira. She whispered, barely audible. The name tasted foreign, but soft. He repeated it once and she blinked slowly. Over the next week she healed. She ate little, slept often, but each day she spoke more. Not in sentences, just fragments, questions mostly. Why help who you trust? Jack answered the best he could. Former field medic. Lost wife 10 years ago. No kids, moved out here to be forgotten. She listened one night while rain tapped on the roof. She said, I carry Jack. Paused. Carry what? Alira placed a hand to her abdomen, glow faint under skin. Not child, not weapon, but both. He didn't understand, not fully, but the look in her eyes said she wasn't guessing. She knew something had changed. Something vital. Jack sat beside her in silence as the storm outside pressed against the walls like an old memory. In the morning she was stronger. They stepped outside for the first time together. The forest had grown quieter since the crash, as if waiting. Alira touched a tree, closed her eyes and breathed deeply. Safe. She said again this time, not as a question. And for the first time, Jack believed it too. What if the quiet you've built for years suddenly becomes too quiet? What if silence stops being peace and starts to feel like warning? Would you trust your gut or wait until it's too late to run? It started with the birds. They stopped singing 2 days in a row, not all at once but in patches. The far ridge would go quiet for an hour, then chirp back into life, only to fade again farther down the valley. Jack noticed it because he had lived here long enough to hear patterns shift. Alira noticed it too. She stood outside every morning, staring at the sky that had once brought fire and death. Her shoulders tight, her fingers twitching like something inside her was already calculating routes out. Jack watched her and didn't ask. She would tell him when she had the words. And she did. On the third night, under a sky streaked with cold moonlight, she turned to him as they sat by the fire and said, They come. He didn't ask who. He just nodded and started packing the things they couldn't replace. Food supplies, emergency comms, his father's old field knife. Alira helped, but her movements were slow. Distracted. They want the child, she said. You're not pregnant. Jack replied, not in the way we understand it. She looked down at her hands, then back up. Seed, memory, instinct, fusion. All at once inside me. It grows. Is it dangerous? Yes and no, she said. It depends who holds it. That night, Jack didn't sleep. He sat outside with the fire, low rifle across his lap, the same one he hadn't touched in a decade. The scanner pinged at dawn. Unidentified energy signature Eastridge, moving slow but steady. He had programmed the scanner to ignore weather, wildlife, and atmospheric fluctuations. This was none of those. Jack woke Alira and handed her the emergency pack. Go west through the creek. Follow the old mineral line. I'll draw them off. She shook her head. Together. No, Jack said. If they see you, they'll never stop, but she wouldn't leave. She placed both hands on his chest and said, If I run now, I never stop running. We stand here, we fight here. He didn't argue again. They set traps, old earth tricks, trip lines with flares, pits disguised with leaf cover, sonic decoys meant to distort sensors. It wasn't enough. At noon they came. A vessel dark as obsidian, silent but heavy, casting a shadow over the clearing before settling in a hiss of displaced air. 3 figures emerged, tall armored visors glowing a cold blue. One spoke, returned the carrier. Jack stood between them and Alira, weapon down but voice steady. She is under my protection, then you die first. They moved fast, too fast. Jack barely raised his rifle before the first soldier was on him, but a blast of light threw the attacker back. Not from Jack, but from Alira. She stood now, glowing slightly, hands out, eyes like twin stars. The second attacker hesitated too long. Jack dropped him with one clean shot. The third retreated, calling for backup. Alira fell to her knees, drained. Jack caught her, held her close. "We need to move." "No," she whispered. "We need to end this. Have you ever had to protect something you did not fully understand? Have you ever looked into someone's eyes and seen both terror and trust, and known you had no right to either?" They ran until nightfall. Not far, just deep enough into the canyon that Jack knew would confuse tracking signals. The terrain was uneven, full of iron veins that bent radio pulses and magnetic fields. He had taken shelter here once during a storm that lasted 4 days. Now he returned with someone who had brought her own storm. Alira collapsed the moment they stopped. Jack caught her mid-fall, felt the heat radiating from her skin. It wasn't fever. Not exactly. Something in her was changing faster than her body could endure. She whispered something in her language, then bit down in a scream. "It's time," she gasped. "For what?" "The child." "But you said, not born as you think, but still must pass through." Jack looked around. No clean ground, no soft place, just rocks, moss, and shadows. He laid her down, pulled off his jacket, folded it beneath her head. "Tell me what to do. Keep me from dying," she said, eyes wide and wild. The next hour was a blur of movement and blood and sound. Jack had delivered babies during war, but this was nothing like that. Alira convulsed, not in pain but in resonance, her body pulsing light from the veins, glowing blue and violet and gold. He held her hand the entire time. She screamed once and the cave walls trembled. Then silence and a sound Jack hadn't expected. Crying. Soft, high-pitched, but unmistakably infant. Alira reached out with trembling arms and Jack placed the child in them carefully. Small, perfect, glowing slightly, like moonlight on snow. "Girl or boy?" Jack asked softly. Alira smiled. "Both, neither. Something new. What do we call her?" She looked at Jack, eyes soft despite exhaustion. "You choose." He thought for a moment, then whispered Nori. "It means light in the dark." Alira nodded once, then closed her eyes, not in death but in sleep. The child in her arms blinked once slowly, then turned to Jack as if recognizing him. He felt something then, not fear, not duty, but awe and a fierce, quiet love. He wrapped them both in the emergency blanket, leaned against the cave wall, and listened to the wind outside, shifting as if the forest itself was adjusting to make room for something new. What if the greatest power in the galaxy was hidden, not inside a weapon or throne or prophecy, but inside the laughter of a child? Would we still call it a threat, or would we dare to call it a miracle? They had lived in the shadow of silence for nearly 6 years. 6 winters marked only by the quiet arrival of first frost on the grass outside the cabin. 6 springs noted by the smell of pine sap waking from sleep. 6 summers drawn in the slow way. Alira's voice softened and her scars faded, and Jack's hands forgot how to hold a rifle, but remembered how to cradle something new. The girl named Nori was not like other children Jack had seen, and he had seen many in his years as a field medic on a dozen worlds. She was smaller than most, but moved with a kind of stillness that felt ancient. When she looked at trees, they bent toward her, not in wind but in quiet reverence. When she stepped into the river, the fish did not flee, but shimmered close beneath the surface as if drawn to something they could not name. Jack had never been a father, not really, but when Nori cried in the middle of the night and reached for him, he came. When she spoke her first word, not mother or father, but light, he answered. He taught her the names of stars, the stories of the wind, how to track by sound, how to listen to the heartbeat of the forest. Alira taught her what could not be spoken, how to sense danger not in noise but in the shape of quiet, how to recognize truth by how it felt in the chest, not how it sounded in the ears. Their home was no longer just shelter. Jack had carved a greenhouse roof from tempered crystal, salvaged from a downed supply drone. The sunlight fell through in soft squares that danced on the wooden floor like memories of warmth. They had books, 100 real paper books, and old data pads filled with music and maps and dreams. And every night before bed, they lit one small fire in the center of the floor and told stories not of war or prophecy, but of kindness, of a bird who once brought fire to a mountain just to warm a lonely cave, of a tree that waited centuries just to be touched by someone who believed it could sing. Then, on the day of the first snow, Nori touched a stone and everything changed. It was an accident or so, Jack thought at first. They were out gathering roots along the canyon trail when she stepped off the path and knelt before a half-buried slate of dark crystal, no larger than a dinner plate. He called out to her, but she didn't answer. Her hands hovered above the stone, fingers trembling, but not from cold. She touched it and the world blinked. Jack staggered as a pulse passed through him. Not pain, not sound, but memory. He saw stars unfamiliar and yet known. He saw a door in a place made of nothing, and light. He saw Nori standing in front of it, older, different, glowing. Then it was gone. He rushed to her, but she stood unharmed, confused but smiling. "What happened?" he asked. It said hello. She replied simply. He asked who. The stone Jack dug around the stone, cleared the soil and roots, and uncovered a spiral of symbols etched into the surface, glowing faintly with a pulse that matched the rhythm of Nori's breath. Alira arrived, breathless, saw the stone and went pale. "Where did you find this? It found me," Nori said. Alira knelt slowly, eyes locked on the markings. "This is a seal from the Vault of Echoes, a lock from the old world. It only responds to the blood of Bridgeborn." Jack looked at her. "You never said she was a key?" "I didn't know," Alira replied softly. "I thought she was a seed, something new, not something needed." "What does it open, hope?" Alira said, "or horror?" For the first time since the crash, Jack felt the old weight return, responsibility. Not to survive, but to choose. They returned home in silence. That night, Nori sat by the fire between them and asked the question they both had avoided. "Am I broken?" Jack answered, first voice, rough from smoke and truth. "No," he said, "you are the proof that we are not. You are the proof that something good can grow from fire." Alira placed a hand on the girl's back, eyes shining with tears. "You are not the end of anything," she said. "You are the beginning." And outside the sky rippled. A line of violet fire stitched across the heavens. Symbols formed of pure light, fading as quickly as they came. Jack stepped out and watched the stars rearrange themselves. For the second time in his life, Alira stood beside him and whispered, "They know she's awakened." He didn't ask who. He just placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered back, "Then let them come." What if the thing you feared the most was not a monster waiting in the dark, but a truth buried inside yourself, waiting to wake? What if the voice calling you forward sounded like your own, but older, heavier, wiser? Would you follow it into the unknown? 3 days after the sky lit up with fire again, the forest changed. It wasn't something Jack could measure, not with tools or trackers, but with the quiet ways. Animals moved the way the wind hesitated before slipping between branches, the way his own heartbeat seemed to echo louder in his ears. Nori began hearing things. At first, it was just a hum, soft low, like the distant breath of a mountain. Then words, not in English, not in Alira's tongue, but in something deeper. A language made of rhythm and memory. She would stop mid-step, tilt her head and whisper back, "They are waiting," she said, once eyes fixed on the horizon. "Who the keepers?" The ones before Alira paled but said nothing. She had known this might come, that the vaults of her ancestors were not just stories but places that still pulsed with purpose, locked to all but one kind. Nori was that kind. They left the next morning. Jack didn't ask where, only packed what they would need: rations, water, medical supplies, a knife that had once saved his life, and a blanket that still carried Nori's scent from the night she first slept through the dark. The journey took them north beyond the ravines and the old mining fields into land. Jack hadn't crossed since before the crash. The terrain grew stranger. Trees thicker, older, their bark etched with natural grooves that resembled script stones shaped like teeth, rose from the earth in clusters, each pointing toward a center they could not yet see. On the fourth night, they found it. A valley cut in a perfect circle. The trees ended at its edge as if forbidden from entering. At its center stood a spire, black glass and bone, twisted together like sculpture and tomb, the vault. Nori stepped forward first. The moment her feet touched the valley floor, the wind stopped. The birds fled and the sky turned gold. She reached the base and placed her hand against the surface. It opened. No sound. No creak of ancient doors, just a ripple like water disturbed. Inside was darkness, not empty but waiting. Jack hesitated. Alira touched his arm. She must go alone. Jack shook his head. "She's a child, she's more than that." Alira said, "She's the reason this door opened." Nori turned and looked back. "It's safe," she said, "for me." Then she vanished into the dark. Jack sat at the threshold counting breaths. He had no idea how much time passed, only that the stars changed twice and Alira didn't sleep once. Then light a soft blue pulse from within the vault, spreading outward like dawn from a single spark. Nori stepped out, eyes wide, not afraid, not exhausted, but changed. She carried something small in her hand, a sphere of light the size of a stone, smooth warm, pulsing. "What is it?" Jack asked. Her voice was calm. "The memory of my people." Alira knelt. "It chose you." "No, Nori said I chose it." The vault behind her shimmered once more and sealed shut forever. That night they camped at the valley's edge and Nori spoke of what she'd seen. Voices without mouths, beings made of thought, offering her knowledge not as command but as choice. They showed her what could come, what must be stopped, what still had hope, and all of it rested on her. Jack listened, not with fear, but with a steady heart, the kind of heart that grows not from strength but from choosing to love something you don't understand. As Nori slept, he looked up at the stars and whispered, "She's ready for the galaxy." But is the galaxy ready for her? Have you ever stood in the middle of something ancient and known? It was calling you by name, not because of who you are, but because of who you could be. What if your blood carried a map and every step you took was waking a war? You never started but were born to finish. They did not return home. Not really. After the vault awakened, the forest no longer felt like it belonged only to them. Every leaf whispered now. Every shadow felt watched, not with malice but with memory. Nori no longer glowed only at night. The light within her had grown subtler but deeper, flickering just beneath the skin like veins of starlight waiting beneath the surface of a frozen sea. Alira was quiet most days, watching her daughter like a priest might watch a sunrise, both in awe and in mourning. Jack busied himself. He added reinforcements to the perimeter, updated the old sensors, patched comm lines to frequencies no longer used, but he knew he felt it in the way. Birds flew lower, and in the way, wolves howled. Not at the moon, but toward the east. Something was coming. It arrived not with a fleet, but a whisper. The trees began dying in straight lines from the edge of the canyon inward. At first, Jack thought it was disease. Then he saw the burn marks, the incisions precise. Each one a coded signature. Harvesters, Alira said. Not machines exactly, but beings stripped of thought turned into weapons. Only one directive, find and extract the source, Nori. They are not sentient. Alira added, but they do not stop. That night they fled again, but this time they didn't run to hide. They ran to lead. Nori had seen this in the vault. She knew where the final stand would need to be. Not a place of safety, but of meaning. The high mesa at the edge of the old world where sky meets stone, where the stars had first spoken to her in dreams. They arrived after 3 days of travel, bruised cold but intact. There was no shelter, only rock and horizon. "This will do," she said simply. Jack looked around. "It's too exposed, it's honest," she replied. They came at dawn, not ships, but shadows, creatures shaped from light and wire and hunger, each one moving in silence, their limbs twitching with purpose. Jack and Alira stood between them and the girl who glowed. But Nori stepped forward. She didn't raise her hands, she didn't shout. She just sang. Not a song of notes, but of feeling. A tone that came from her bones, not her throat. The harvesters froze, one by one. Their limbs shook, their lights dimmed. Then they began to crack. The sound was like ice breaking on a deep lake. One fell, then another. They didn't explode, didn't scream, they simply unraveled. Alira wept, Jack couldn't breathe. Nori stood still until the last one faded like mist in the sun. Then she fell to her knees. He caught her before she hit the stone. "It's done," she whispered. "No," Jack said, "it's only just beginning." He carried her back across the ridge, her weight light, but her presence heavier than anything he had ever known. That night by a fire made not for warmth, but for memory, he told her the story of how he once found a girl in the forest, a girl who bled stars and cried like rain. She slept in his arms, and for the first time since the vault opened, the world felt quiet again. Have you ever wondered what comes after the end? Not the end of the world, but the end of fear, the end of running. What would you do if everything that tried to break you only made you softer? Would you let that softness become your strength? The fire burned low, just enough to crackle against the silence of the mountain night. Jack sat beside Nori, her head resting in his lap, eyes closed but not asleep. He brushed a leaf from her hair and remembered when she was small enough to fit in the crook of his arm, when she asked if the stars ever got lonely. They do. He had told her back then, but they also shine so others can find them. She remembered that he knew, because she had become one. The girl who glowed was no longer a child. Something in the vault had changed her not in body, but in gravity. She held attention now, not by asking for it, but by simply existing in a way that demanded reverence. Alira returned from the ridge silently, her eyes watching the valley below, where strange lights moved again. They are searching. She whispered for her, for the memory she carries. Jack nodded slowly. Let them search. They will not find what they want because Nori was not a secret anymore. She was a choice, her own choice. Not created by war or prophecy or accident, but by the decision to exist as herself in a world that wanted to make her something else. She stirred now, opening her eyes. They come again, she said softly. Not to take, not to fight, but to ask. Jack looked at Alira, then back to Nori. And what will you say? She smiled. That depends on how they listen. When the sky split again, it was not with fire, but with silence. A ship descended, not black, not sharp, but soft. Its curves fluid, like it had grown, not been built. It landed without sound. No soldiers, no weapons. Only one figure emerged, tall, thin, draped in white light that moved like wind through grass. They did not speak with words, but Nori heard them. She stepped forward past Jack, past Alira, and met the figure halfway across the rock. They touched hands and the air shimmered. Jack saw flashes, memories, places he had never been, languages he had never learned. He saw Nori grown, walking among stars, teaching singing, planting light where darkness had lived too long. He saw her die not in pain but in purpose, her body returning to the dust of comets, her name becoming a word for hope in 100 forgotten tongues. And then it was gone. She turned back to them, eyes wet but unafraid. "I have to go." Jack stood. "For how long?" "As long as I am needed." She walked to him, placed a hand on his chest. "You made me more than a weapon. You made me loved." He nodded, unable to speak. Alira kissed her forehead and whispered a blessing in a language older than war. The ship opened. She stepped inside. The light swallowed her, and then the ship rose, disappeared beyond the clouds without sound or trail. Jack stood there long after it vanished. He would never see her again, but he would hear her in the rustle of trees, in the warmth of firelight in the way. Stars blinked like they were winking just for him. Back at the cabin, he carved her name into stone, not a gravestone, not a shrine. Just a reminder that once a girl came from fire and chose to be more, and that was enough. So, what would you have done? Would you have let her go? Would you have tried to keep her? Or would you have believed like Jack did that? Sometimes the hardest thing you can do is let someone become what they were meant to be. Let us know in the comments if her story moved you or made you wonder what kind of light you might carry too.